It's exciting stuff. Well, as we get started, I'm going to make you get up out of your chairs again one more time. I want anyone in here that is a friend of the Panama Canal Museum collection to stand up, please. And please remain standing. Okay, these are our true heroes, people. They have saved this collection. Let's give them a hand. And then stay standing for a minute, because I want anyone who has used this collection to stand up. If you've used the collection, if you've called the university, gotten information from us, that's a pretty good percentage. It's not too bad. And see what an impact this collection has had, just on this room full of people. And that's incredible. You can sit down now. Thank you very much, and we're indebted to our Panama Canal Museum people for preserving this collection for us and for allowing us to have it and to digitize it. We're very thankful. Thank you. It's my pleasure to introduce the final panel of speakers in what has been an exciting and informative conference. At least I found it exciting and certainly educational. We thank Richmond Brown profusely and for his coordination of the event, and his office, of course, and all the distinguished speakers who have helped us to understand the global importance of the Panama Canal. Especially during this 2014, did I say centennial year? Have you gotten that now? We're in the centennial year, so come see us again in August, because we have a big party planned then. So please come back in August. Our Panama Canal Museum collection, located within the newly renovated Latin American collection on the third floor of this building, is an opportunity to cultivate a community of support and to feature this historically significant collection. You all will be up there for the reception. If you don't want to stay too long tonight or you're traveling, please do come back and take a look at the Latin American collection. It's a wonderful new venue, and I know that Paul will certainly tour you around and be host. There are some very natural similarities between libraries and museums that make collaboration economical, realistic, and educational. Both entities conserve, preserve, exhibit, and store items, and often researchers and students who frequent one venue frequent the other in their avid search for information. Libraries and museums have similar clientele, always need funds, and offer a lot of the same services and benefits. The mission of the partnership between the Panama Canal Museum and the University of Florida Smathers Libraries is to expand, document, interpret, and preserve the Panama Canal Museum collection and articulate the leadership role of the United States in the history of Panama while respecting the diversity of all cultures involved. So why did the Panama Canal Museum choose UF when they decided to close and transfer the museum? UF's Latin American collection is one of the top 3 collections in the nation and a full partner sponsor for the Digital Library of the Caribbean. With the renowned Center for Latin American Studies and the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program here at UF, we have a large number of people within the Panama Canal Museum and the Panama Canal Society who are UF grads. Florida is also so close geographically to Panama, and UF has many grants and projects in the canal region, including that National Science Foundation PIRE Panama Canal project that you've heard a lot about during this conference. UF is helping to cultivate friends with the priority of sustaining this historic collection. We've developed a committee structure that makes recommendations to our dean, Judy Russell, and the friends have been engaged to help with the exhibits, loan of materials, and promotion through what we call e-blasts, blogs, and newsletters. So they're really helping us to understand this collection, many of us who may or may not have lived in Panama itself or in the Panama Canal Zone. Originally, there were about 800 people who were affiliated with the Panama Canal Museum and about 3,000 Panama Canal Society members. That's a big group of people. The PCS is a social society that has been in operation for over 82 years, and they have a reunion once a year in Orlando that includes an educational exhibit of museum materials. One innovative way to engage all these communities involved placing representatives on cross-disciplinary boards. The Library Leadership Board here has several members of the Friends Executive Council, and a representative from the Panama Canal Society serves on the Friends Board and also serves on the Panama Canal Society Board. It helps to encourage awareness of the initiatives and the support of the collection, and it helps us to communicate everything that all the groups are doing. Progress reports are regularly issued to identify collection processing, numbers of volunteers involved, and lists of conferences, publications, courses, and presentations that involve research and the impacts of using the collection. A basic case study, a case statement about the collection was created at the onset, and this case statement has been tailored to a variety of corporate and philanthropic entities to help raise awareness of the collection. An Institute of Museum and Library Services matching grant was submitted and awarded, totaling $1.2 million for a 3-year period, allowing for a few key hires to be made and for the collection to be inventoried. This collection is about 20,000 items, so it's not a small collection, and we've been trying to inventory it for the past couple of years, and we're almost there. Collection items continue to be donated during annual meetings, and the Friends have raised and solicited endowments, memberships, and support for specific projects such as the digitization of the Panama American, an important newspaper during the Canal Zone years. The collection has fostered a number of new collaborations and partnerships, particularly in Panama, amongst museum, embassy, and archival institutions. We're so glad to have Angeles with us here today, and certainly we have developed many collaborations in Panama. Throughout each collaboration, UF has complied with UNESCO agreements that dictate certain objects be repatriated. Through all of the added exposure to the collections and the partnerships with the National Archives and Record Administration, there have been 5 opportunities this year to support documentaries based on the canal and to be part of such public broadcasting station initiatives as the Engineering Map of America, which includes the Panama Canal. So if you haven't looked at that Engineering Map of America, look it up on the internet. It's really quite interesting to see everything that's pinned underneath the Panama Canal. A number of international entities have increased the collection's reach, including the Panama Canal model gifted by the Netherlands National Bagger Museum. If you haven't looked at it, it's a really big model. It came over in 12 pieces from the Netherlands. They gifted us the model, and we needed to pay to have it shipped over here. Their former director, Hans Wynn, came over to help us to install it, and he was here for over a week's time. And we did some photography and some videotaping of that process because it was so interesting. But we had so many volunteers come and want to work on the model. So the model isn't maybe museum quality necessarily, but it is such an interesting project, and it has served to tour a number of our student groups. So it is a destination now in Florida to come see the Panama Canal. It's 38 feet long, but you know, it's the best we've got here. We have DLOC partnerships. We've also had ENAC from Panama involved, video and photo images that have been shared by the ACP, and have added promotional material to our centennial that's, did I say upcoming in August? We have the Symphony of the Americas coming. We have several library awards and presentations that have been made, and special donations. You'll see one of those special donations upstairs. It is the Great Seal of Panama from Alan and Ann Rothschild. And they donated it to us because they knew that the Panama Canal Museum had transferred their collections to us. So we've been entrusted with that, and it's really a unique piece that is from 1904. One amazing outcome in this museum transfer has been to uncover materials from a diverse cultural standpoint. Cementing relationships with Panama has been a very positive aspect for Florida's economic future from both the centennial and the canal expansion perspectives. This collection, with its historically significant materials, unites people who shared many aspects of a common history. While the U.S. has documented much of the canal history from 1904 to 1999, Panama has developed practices to document their future. An exchange of these materials in digital format certainly benefits all of us. I want to progress now to our panel and introduce them in the order that they'll present. And Dr. Paul Morgan was born and raised in, guess where, the Panama Canal Zone. He served as a chaplain in the U.S. Army, in the United States, and Korea, and Germany. He got around. He has multiple graduate degrees in marriage, family counseling, and child counseling, divinity, international affairs, and history. He has more degrees than I think anybody I've ever known. He's taught courses in both U.S. and Latin American history, and his dissertation was entitled The Role of North American Women in U.S. Cultural Chauvinism in the Panama Canal Zone, 1904 to 1945. And I don't know about you, but I didn't know there was chauvinism in 1904 to 1945, but I've learned something new. Paul Morgan served on the board of the Panama Canal Museum as chair of the Collections Committee and the Nominating Committee, and Dr. Morgan's presentation is entitled The Panama Canal Museum, History in the Attics, Trunks, and Closets. Now, our next presenter will be Paul Loesch, and I'll just tell you everybody in order so I don't have to get up here again. And Paul Loesch is an associate librarian in the Latin American collection of the George A. Smathers Libraries. We mentioned that was on the 3rd floor. Visit him frequently. He has taught both Spanish and Portuguese, has had articles published in the field of Latin American history, and is on the executive board of the seminar on the acquisition of Latin American library materials, that's called SALAM. Paul will be speaking about integrating the Panama Canal Museum collection into the University of Florida libraries. And last but certainly not least is Dr. Paul Ortiz. Notice that we didn't form a singing group. It's Rachel and the 3 Pauls. We were going to do something in sequence together up here, and we thought it might look a little strange at the end of the day. So we thought we'd wait for the reception and see if there are any libation that would help us to loosen up a little bit. We have a lot of academics here. We're a little stiff on our moves. Dr. Paul Ortiz serves as director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and associate professor of history at the University of Florida. He is vice president of the Oral History Association and the recipient of the Florida Education Association's 2013 Cesare Chavez Action and Commitment Award. He is an award-winning author with a focus on African American, Latino studies, and labor history. Paul Ortiz was stationed at Fort Davis, Panama, during his years in the Army Special Forces, and his presentation is titled Oral Histories and Historical Memories of the Panama Canal Zone. So, Paul Morgan. Paul.
Thank you, Rachel, and I will keep my Academy Award acceptance speech short and just say to all of you and to Richmond, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I especially want to thank all of you of the Gator Nation for accepting a Seminole into your Holy of Holies. 1977, you've already heard this, representatives of the United States and Panama signed 2 new treaties that replaced the original 1903 agreement and called for the control of the Panama Canal to be transferred to Panama at the end of 1999. And as the time for that transfer approached, a group of former residents of the Panama Canal Zone, members of the Panama Canal Society, met at their annual reunion and raised a concern that once the U.S. presence left Panama, the institutional memory of those who had lived there and worked for the canal would be lost. So in 1998, these concerned Zonians established the Panama Canal Museum to be housed in Seminole, Florida, to preserve the history of the American era of the canal in Panama. Now, you've already heard the mission statement of the collection here at the University of Florida, but in a sense, part of that obviously was taken from the museum's original mission statement, which was to document, interpret, and articulate the role of the United States in the history of Panama, with emphasis on the construction, operation, maintenance, and defense of the canal, as well as to document the contributions to its success made by members of all nationalities. A central focus in this mission, however, to quote one of the museum's founders, Mr. Joe Wood, was to preserve the history of a unique, culturally and socially cohesive community that was created by the presence of an American jurisdictional entity, the Canal Zone, within the borders of Panama. In other words, the museum was to tell the story of an American enclave located in the midst of the Republic of Panama. Now, the major challenge in preserving such a story is first to find the primary sources of that story to document. What elements tell the story? Where do you find them? Anyone who's ever researched the topic of cultural and social history knows the frustration of having to track down the evidence. National archives and official government records, those alone don't suffice. In my own research into the role of North American women in creating and sustaining U.S. culture in the Canal Zone, I quickly learned that the evidence is not readily at hand. The story is in the people. And that means in their memoirs and diaries, in their letters, in their oral histories, in the social columns of local newspapers like the Star and Herald, the Panama American, in the minutes of private club meetings. And for me, this meant not only taking trips to the National Archives to check official Canal Zone government and Panama Canal Company files, but trips to Panama and the Technical Services Center in the former Canal Zone to scour the microfilm libraries for social columns in Panamanian newspapers. It also meant interviewing women at the Panama Canal Society's annual reunions and women in the West Indian community of Panama. It meant going through all of the club records at the headquarters of the General Federation of Women's Clubs in Washington, D.C., et cetera, et cetera. And I remember thinking, if only the primary materials were collected together and stored in some central depository. In a sense, in my mind, that was one reason to have a Panama Canal Museum. A central place where former residents of Panama and the Canal Zone could send the stuff of their experiences living and working on the Panama Canal. The stuff that they had tucked away in their attics, trunks, closets, basements. Well, although I had finished my research by the time the museum was up and running, this same rationale led me to want to volunteer at the museum. After the museum opened, it didn't take long before Zonians were sending in their stuff. Now, among the items were artifacts of known historical importance that chronicled the times leading up to and through the construction of the Panama Canal. From lithographs of 16th century Spanish maps to a copy of the document establishing the Panama Railroad, from objects from the French Canal period to original Roosevelt medals that were awarded to construction workers, along with, of course, the documents and reports from the Isthmian Canal Commission. But as we began to sort through and accession and catalog the items that had been donated, it also became apparent that many contributors felt that anything related to life in the Panama Canal Zone was an artifact. Folks were cleaning out their attics and their closets of things they had accumulated in a lifetime in Panama. Now, I'm going to take you back a few years ago. Hopefully, most of you remember the comic George Carlin. And Carlin used to do a routine about how you have to get your stuff together. And then you move. And when you move, you take your stuff with you. And then you accumulate more stuff until you move again. Well, many Zonians no longer wanted to keep their stuff. But they couldn't bring themselves to throw it away. There's something sacred about memories and memorabilia. Their kids didn't want it because it didn't mean anything to them. Many of them were born in the States after mom and dad retired, came back up to the States. So whatever mom and dad brought from Panama, from the Canal Zone, didn't quite mean the same thing to them. So let's send it to the museum. Now, at first, some of us volunteers didn't feel like we should accession such items. I mean, was the museum simply going to be a bigger attic or closet to store this stuff? It was true that Zonians might like a museum where they could come and visit their stuff and get nostalgic for the good old days, take a trip down memory lane. But would the general public be interested in that? Well, ultimately, two reasons prevailed for our being more liberal in our accessioning. As our Executive Vice President Kathy Egolf said, if we reject these lesser artifacts now, the same people might not send us the more historically valuable items later, the real goodies, when they're finally ready to let go of them. And that was true. But the second reason came later when we were planning exhibits on life in the Panama Canal Zone for the Panama Canal Society reunions and for other traveling displays. And that reason was the realization that the story of daily life is often found in the most mundane and personal items. For example, when we look at a milk carton, or an ice cream container, or the wrappers from loaves of bread produced by Panama Canal Company bakeries and dairies, or menus from government hotel dining facilities, or items that passengers have kind of confiscated during their travel on Panama Line ships. What do these things tell us? Is there any story in them? Well, they do indicate just how much of a self-sufficient company town or entity the Canal Zone was, with its own commissaries, dining facilities, and yes, even passenger ships. The 1950s commissary coupon booklets of varying dollar amounts that employees had allotted from their monthly pay in order to shop in the commissary, along with their ID cards, give evidence not only to government control and government provision, but to policies to restrict the authority to purchase to Canal Zone employees or U.S. military. Those policies were also instituted to reassure the Panamanian government that the commissary was not going to be open to non-Zonians and therefore would not be undermining Panamanian merchants with the Panamanian people. English language editions of Panamanian newspapers reported not only the news of Panama, but of the Canal Zone neighborhood events, including the gossip, mirroring the society columns that covered social news in Panama in the Spanish language editions. Some donations were even more of a personal nature. The museum received letters and postcards Zonians had written to family in the States during the construction days and during other major periods of history, such as the Great Depression, World War II, giving a picture of life in the Canal Zone during those times. Museum volunteers catalog personal photos of men and women at work on the canal and in government offices. They catalog yearbooks of youth in Canal Zone high school activities. They catalog pictures of families that are engaged in recreational activities typical for the area: swimming, fishing, hiking in the jungle. All of these personal photographs were supplementing the photographic work of the official Panama Canal photographers. And then there were the items that demonstrated how Zonians were culturally influenced by the greater environment in which they lived. Recipes of Panamanian dishes, recordings of favorite music by Panamanian musicians like Lucho Escarga, native dress that Zonians would wear when participating in Panama's annual carnival, paintings by Panamanian artists, and the indigenous artwork like the reverse applique molas from the Kuna Indians in the San Blas Islands, and the wooden bateas and trays that were made up in the interior of Panama. These items were collected by Zonians and graced their homes, later to become artifacts in the museum. Now, all of these objects, from the historically noteworthy to the mundane, from the governmental to the social and cultural, all of them tell the story of the American era in Panama, how those who worked on the Panama Canal and in the Canal Zone lived, how they created an overseas community based on traditional American values and culture, and how these values both influenced and were influenced by the culture of Panama. The purpose of the canal zone was to house and to support those who operated, maintained, and defended the Panama Canal. Now, whether history concludes that the canal zone was simply an overseas U.S. government reservation, like its many military counterparts around the globe, or a more permanent U.S. colony, culturally and politically, that Theodore Roosevelt claimed America would never attempt in Panama, it nevertheless was a unique entity. From the perspective of scholarship, the archives and the artifacts in the Panama Canal Museum collection here at the University of Florida provide a repository and a fertile ground for the study of both the great engineering feat that is the canal and the American enclave that sustained it. And selfishly, if you will, from the perspective of genealogy, the collection provides persons with familial ties to those who lived and worked there an opportunity to learn more about their families. But overall, among other things, the collection simply makes up the stuff of a unique story. Thank you.
Bear with me for just 1 minute, please. Thank you very much, Paul. That's a hard act to follow. And I think it's right here. No, yeah, it's opening slowly. All right. Which one? Okay. I'll just point out at this point that I'm actually, even though there are three people named Paul on this panel, I'm the odd one out because I'm the only one on the panel that never lived in Panama for a significant amount of time. Everyone else on this panel, at least for a number of months, in the case of Rachel and longer in the case of the other colleagues on the panel. And actually, Brazil is the country in Latin America I know best. I lived there for 3 years, and everyone who's in Latin American studies usually has some country that they consider they know the best. I think I'm a Brazilianist, but by the nature of this work, I guess I'm getting to know something about Panama and the Canal Zone. And I've learned a lot. It's really been by working with this collection, and it was something that came to us as an opportunity to receive this collection, and so working with it, as Paul was saying, these things capture a certain time and place, and I've been able to get to know something about that time and place through working with the collection. And so I'm, as you know, Paul has talked about how the collection was created, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how it was received here, and the work a little bit about the collection. I've got some pictures, because some people are still wondering, what are they talking about? And I'd like to show a few pictures of examples, but also talk a little bit about some of the challenges and the successes. And so I'll also mention that in addition to the pictures that I have, there are some exhibit cases in this room where you can see some of the objects, but not all of the exhibit cases in this room are drawn, just to be clear, from the museum's collections. For example, there are a few books, actually some by authors who've spoken here or from the Museo del Canal Interoceánico or things like that. There are very recent publications that we put on display. When you come upstairs later, you'll see some other displays. Anyway, let me advance through these slides and show you. Again, I want to show you a few pictures just so you have an idea of something about the collection. But I'm going to start with some frequently asked questions. Is it working okay? Or? Oh, right. Thank you. So, in an attempt to kind of give you, to start out on a light note, we get phone calls, and these are some of the questions that people ask, and I'll say that sometimes the answers I give are disappointing. For example, the first one, what are the hours of your museum? As if we actually have a functioning museum here in the library. And as you can see, we do have some display cases, and we do have some things that can be seen in this building, but we don't have the same setup that existed down in Seminole, Florida, which is a small suburb. It's a suburb of St. Petersburg. We don't have that setup, so it's not really. Some people are disappointed when they say, "What can I?" I'm planning a trip to Gainesville, and what are your hours? What's your admission fee, and that sort of thing. No, we're really set up as a university library, and it's a different environment. And so that's I have to tell people that, and I think they're disappointed when I explain it, but I try to explain it as best I can. Another question that's kind of interesting, and I point this one out to illuminate something. Do you have my ancestors' service records? A lot of people think that, for example, we got all of the paperwork of the United States government, but that all went to the National Archives. And actually, we've learned that some things are held by the Department of Defense and some things are in the National Archives, and we've learned a little bit about how to direct people, but they're sometimes optimistic that we will have certain things that we don't have. And people can find us online. So, and I think my name is the first one, and my phone number, and so I get some of these calls. There are also a related question to this is there was a Canal Zone Library and Museum that existed that was an official museum, and most of what was there went to the Library of Congress, and it's also in the federal hands. It's in Washington. This collection is different. It's not that formal collection that was organized by the government of the Canal Zone. That again, it resides in Washington. This is more like I compare it to many cities and towns have had historical societies that take in objects, and so it's what was received, as Paul was explaining, not necessarily what was collected by the official museum. So that's an interesting distinction because it's what people have wanted to give. A third question: do you know what this is worth? And that's there was someone who asked last week. They said, I have something. I think it was a small album of postcards, and I had to. And I thought to myself, I think that program, Antiques Roadshow, has inspired a lot of people to look in their attic and think maybe I'm really going to cash in here. I couldn't tell you what things are worth because it's all been a donation. Okay, I haven't. We have, at some point in the future, we could consider perhaps making purchases or something to expand the collection, but until we really know what we have, it doesn't make sense in going out and buying something because we may open a box and find out we already have it. So if you see what I mean, I don't think at this point, we're not in the market, so I'm not in a position to say what things are worth. So, we've received this as a gift again, and with actually a generous endowment to go with it. So, another thing that puts me a little, I feel like I give a disappointing answer anyway, when someone calls and says, I'll be in Gainesville tomorrow, I'm doing research for a book on such and such, what will you have readily available to show me? Well, it's not quite that simple because things are still being processed and organized. I'm used to being able to, for example, with a library catalog, by the time the person arrives, have a stack of books to put on the table for them. And it's not quite like that. This is a complex collection. If you give me a little advance, and I say this because I know there's a lot of historians in the room and that are always looking for new sources. So please give us a little time right ahead. Let us know what you're looking for. Maybe we'll find something great. And then, is everything online somewhere? And because people are getting a little spoiled and they are getting used to the idea that a lot of things are online, but it's not all online yet. We are working very actively to put things online. And as a matter of fact, Rachel was mentioning earlier some collaborations with our other units on campus, and of course the center and the oral history program, and I believe that most of these proceedings are being recorded thanks to help from the oral history program, and that they will end up in our digital collections online. So everything is going online eventually, but it's not there yet. Okay, so. Anyway, I will be able to show you a little bit about some of the digitization work that we have done so far, okay? So again, those are questions that people sometimes ask where I have to disappoint. Here, as Paul said, the collection was created from many trunks and photo albums that were all received in the museum. And there's a picture that some of you will recognize yourselves. I actually stole that picture from the St. Petersburg Times. They had an article when the museum closed, and this graphic was just to give you the idea. Things were received by the museum and then transferred here to this library. And so the organization of it is really, we're still going through it and learning just what we have. Again, why the University of Florida? Rachel already mentioned some of that. We had already had some expertise in these areas, and so and there is a Florida tie. I think that many people are here in Florida that would be interested in this. And so what does the collection actually contain? Again, as Rachel said, it contains, I'm sorry, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
All right. We estimate around 2,000 items. When we received it, there was a lot of notation. We received a database of about 11,000 or so entries, but sometimes we would find out that one entry stood for a few things. So we've tried to expand the number of entries. I believe it's up to around 16,000 now, but also to add information to those entries in the database. Again, as a way to know better, so that if someone asks, what do you have on, we have kind of subject information to tell you. But so just to give you a quick idea, and by the way, I should mention that there's, the physical collections, these are what we have, and then there's digital collections, and so we do have to make that distinction. And again, as I said, not everything has been digitized yet, right? And as it says that we're still receiving donations, so that number 20,000 should grow. I think it was Monday of this week, I was called, someone's here that wants to give something for the Panama Canal Museum collection. A couple that was driving on their vacation from Madison, Wisconsin to spend a week in Sarasota, and the Canes, and they said, we found out online that you had a Panama Canal Museum collection, and we had these things in the attic, and we were kind of concerned that no one wanted them, and nothing would be done with them if we didn't bring them here. And the first thing they showed me was there were a few things. One was a book that we already had, I think, 4 copies of. So as politely as I could, I double checked to make sure it wasn't a different edition or something. I think there were maybe more than 4 copies. So I said, thank you very much, but we don't need that. Another thing was a book that we did have 1 copy of, but it's good to have a second copy. So thank them for that. But then the other thing, it was very interesting. It turns out her grandfather was something like the shop steward for the Railroad Conductors Union, and in 1907 he filed a grievance, and there was a long administrative hearing, and she had all the paperwork from those hearings, and I imagine that maybe there's another copy somewhere deep in the National Archives, but we have the copy that was given to the shop steward, and it's in a binder, and I think that I mentioned, I said, there's actually someone who is a labor historian who has studied labor in the canal zone who will be coming. This is just the kind of thing that a historian, oh, that's great. Someone would want to look at it? Yes, someone would want to look at this, I'm sure. And she felt very happy about that. And then when I mentioned she had actually, I believe, seen the American Experience video, and I believe that Professor Green is interviewed in that, and so she was very pleased to know that someone that she had seen on TV would maybe see the thing that she had that she didn't think was worth anything. So it was kind of a nice opportunity to say, that this was the right place, and thank you for bringing it. And so that was an experience really, on Monday, kind of made for this opportunity here to tell you about, right? It's a kind of a nice find, and as Paul says, sometimes in a gift you get things that you wanted more than others, and you have to deal with that. So books, we have a lot of books, and we're used to dealing with books as a library, and again, some are on display, and we have they get cataloged. You can see call number stickers on them, on at least a couple of them. I guess one of them hasn't been cataloged yet, but anyway, those are, by the way, digital images that I've lifted from our digital collections. Again, making the distinction here, physical, we have the physical book, but we also have the digital version that can be consulted. A good thing is that many of the publications are from 1922 or before, so the copyright issues aren't so complicated. And also, many of these things are government publications, as you'll see. Actually, that's been a major effort of ours, is to put the government publications online. Those are not only free, but encouraged. We are encouraged to make them available. So the one on the gray book up there, actually, there's only one or two other copies in the country, and it's The American Woman on the Panama Canal. And I think you'd looked at it for your work, and we're pleased to have it, and to have it online. And there were actually people there was someone at Yale who wanted to be able to see it. We were able to get it digitized because we weren't going to send it to Yale. And so we're able to do things like that. And again, government publications, much of what was published in the Canal Zone, again, was a government publication. And so you see some reports there, and a colleague of mine who is not in the room right now, Chelsea Dinsmore, was able to organize these and get them digitized and get them online. In many cases, we already had very complete sets of these because UF is a part of the depository system of government documents and has been for many years, but sometimes it's a matter of getting the collections complete and getting them online and so forth. So there's also, you'll see up there a couple newspapers, and we had different ways, either through private donations or working with a private company that wanted to get these things done. We were able to get some microfilmed newspapers digitized. And again, just to bring up that issue about, do you have all the official documentation? No, but we do have all the kinds of things that people tucked in their briefcase and brought home. And I guess you could call them fugitive federal records or something like that, right? That things that really weren't published in the sense of made available to everyone, but were kind of internal working documents. And I think that those are actually very valuable as for research. A couple of the items in the middle are actually people's service records, but again, we don't hold everyone's records or their birth certificates or diplomas or things like that. People do ask. photographs are the number one most common thing in the collection. And some of them were, as you can see here, there's an example of a stereograph photo. Photography was kind of a new and novel thing at the time, and so postcards and stereographs, this was a widely photographed subject. And one of my colleagues who's working on this project, Rebecca Fitzsimmons, is very into the history of photography, and she was able to get some of these things digitized. And also, some of what you see here, there was very much an extensive program of the government to document everything that was being done in the canal zone as a way to show the work that was being done. We do not have some people ask about this, the complete set that went to Washington and that kind of thing, but we have many examples from that set, and I believe that some of the cases in the back of the room here have some of those photos that you can look at more closely before you go. A complicated thing about photos, though, is sometimes, if we're lucky, they have captions, but they don't always, right? And so one thing that has been nice is, and I didn't work this into the presentation, but there's actually a blog where some of the volunteers that are processing these things, they put them online and say, who is in this photo? Could you tell me? And sometimes people are able to write in and say where the picture was taken or who's in it or things like that. And it's a kind of an interesting way of, one of the expressions is crowdsourcing the metadata, or, really kind of reaching out to the wider public through online methods to try to get their suggestions and ideas about what is contained in the photos. Again, another thing that we have in large number are artifacts of different kinds, and this is actually a little bit outside of what library collections often have. We think of information on paper as a very traditional idea, but as technology is changing the library world, and as, for example, access to some kinds of information is really kind of become standard. Everyone can read certain journals or statistical publications online. Individual libraries have to identify areas of strength and really develop those collections and try to come up with something unique. And this is certainly something unique that fits with our mission. So again, here are some examples. I thought these were interesting as badges, but also the license plates, and how the license plate they were donated together. So I would imagine they came from the same car that in '78 and '79 was registered in the canal zone, and 1980 was registered with Unidad hacia el Futuro. So kind of an interesting. There's a story right there in two license plates, right? Again, we kind of gave each other a funny look because he was going to mention the milk cartons. This one's actually, I think, orange juice. But the idea is that these are articles from daily life, and there was this kind of society that had its own postage system, its own railroad, its own commissaries, and other kinds of social services and again, like I said, we're used to paper with information on it. Well, that's paper with information on it. It's not the kind that we're used to because it's in the shape of a milk carton. But we're learning. We're learning to deal with things that aren't bound in a book or that kind of thing. So. Another thing that is, also a part of the collection is there is a lot of artwork, and here I just show a couple items from a larger collection of molas, and now is probably a good time to mention that there will be, as Rachel was saying, exhibits on campus in August, and one of the exhibits will feature mola artwork, and not that these necessarily will be the ones that are featured, but I just thought these were interesting objects out of the many that had been photographed. So, an important theme is school memorabilia, and You know, there was an interesting thing was that we wanted to make sure that we've covered things from all of the different schools within the Canal Zone school system. Thanks. And so we've been able to have some help adding to our collection, developing it further. So some of the challenges that we've had involve really, I guess the larger question is how to integrate a small private museum and its collections and its supporting community into the operations of a large academic library. And we were fortunate to receive a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And with that grant, we were able to hire a wonderful team of people to work on this project, and because it really it's a major project, and so to be able to get extra help and have people that are really dedicated to this has been very important. And there's a whole team, and I won't go into everything now, but our time is running short, but please I guess I could acknowledge there are a few people in the room. I see Rebecca and I see Lee Herring, and well, there's those are just some of the people that Lourdes, who's done a lot of the exhibits. I don't see her here. There's, and of course Rachel, and I'll just move right through here. Let's see. So we've been able to do a lot of things in our during this period. One thing that again is an expected outcome from the grant is an eventual case study on museum library integration. And there's some this is because this is not just a problem or a challenge or an issue for the University of Florida and the Panama Canal Museum. The reason for this grant was because there are many small cultural institutions around the country that have decided that they can't go on in the long run, but they have a lot of good things that need to be preserved and organized, and they're approaching larger institutions. And so how do you do that? How do you integrate? So, again, even this conference here has been a great opportunity to bring together different units from around campus, and to at a state university that doesn't always, isn't always that well endowed. Really, we get more done when we have different units working together and applying our energies in the same direction. And for example, in August, there'll be exhibits in all the different library facilities on campus, but also the museums on campus will be cooperating in the Performing Arts Center and so forth. So, please come back. And people who ask, when's the museum going to be open? Well, come in August, and will be something like a museum at that point, and ready to really show off a lot more. Okay, so thank you, and I'll turn things over now to.
Well, I guess I'm the second person now to say thank you, Paul. And thank all of you for staying the course and being with us in this panel. In colloquial terms, we were referring to it as Rachel and the Three Pauls. I'm just so happy to be here. I want to start by thanking the UF Center for Latin American Studies for organizing such a wonderful conference. The Samuel Proctor Oral History Program is a really special relationship with Latin American Studies. Many of you have already met Deborah Hendrix. The Oral History Program is a wonderful videographer who's been taping a lot of the sessions, as Paul mentioned, for posterity's sake, for our sake. I also want to introduce Genesis Laura, who is the Oral History Program's actually first ever Latino history research coordinator, and also dear colleague Lauren Krebs, who was the Oral History Program's web manager during her time as undergraduate. So you can see that we've had this wonderfully close relationship, working relationship between the two programs. I also want to start by thanking my colleague Joe Wood and Rachel Shipper for giving the Oral History Program the opportunity to work on this wonderful project, and for giving me a chance to, in many ways, return to a country that I never imagined returning to. As Rachel mentioned, I was with the 7th Special Forces Group in the early 80s. Unfortunately, I didn't spend too much time in country. We were generally deployed. I did watch the ships go through the locks periodically. That was really a spectacular sight. We spent most of our time elsewhere throughout Central America. But the time that I was in country, I did have the chance to interact a lot with Panamanians, particularly on the Atlantic side of the country. So it's been really a profound experience for me to be part of this wonderful collaboration between the libraries, Latin American Studies, the museum, and other key stakeholders. The thing I really want to emphasize today in terms of the Oral History Project is we're just getting started. We're really just beginning. We have a total of 51 oral histories now. The bulk of our interviews were conducted with participants, people who lived in the Panama Canal Zone, but among that group, and I'll give a little breakdown in a couple of minutes, the initial kind of large bulk of interviews were conducted with folks who attend the Panama Canal reunion. So that was the first kind of cohort. And speaking of that, how many of you have been interviewed so far for this project? Very good. How many of you would like to be interviewed? Or how many of you know people who would like to be interviewed? Don't be shy. Everyone has a story to tell. I want to talk about some of the themes in the interviews and give you a little breakdown of what we have so far. And again, understand this is an oral history project in progress. Again, we have 51 total interviews, 31 men, 20 female, but also some husband and wife group interviews. And the husband and wife interviews are fascinating. They're really interesting in the information that comes out. It's also interesting who talks more than the other sometimes, and whose interpretation, whose memory of history, because this is a memory archive, ends up holding pride of place. 2 individuals in that collection identify as individuals of African descent. We are building on that, and we'll actually be interviewing more individuals of African descent in August, and we've been working on building that part of the collection. Some of the other characteristics of this collection that are quite interesting, almost every single narrator, and in oral history terminology, we used to use the term interviewee. That sounds too CIA-like, so we now use narrator. Almost every narrator who worked for a salary was intensively, not just satisfied with their working lives, but intensively satisfied with their working lives, with their careers. That's striking. I'm a labor historian, and when I interview people about their working lives, you get a mix of people who some enjoyed work, others hated it. Almost every person that we've interviewed who worked in the Panama Canal Zone for any length of time loved what they did. They loved their work. That's very interesting. 8 of the narrators believe strongly that the canal is run more efficiently today. I also find that to be very, very interesting, very revealing. 9 of the narrators referred to the Panama Canal Zone during the years they lived there as socialistic, as almost a socialist kind of society, and I see Paul waving his head. 8 of the narrators discuss racial segregation very frankly, very, very candidly, and not just the segregation, but the inequalities between black and white, between Zonians and Panamanian citizens. Most of the narrators talk very candidly about personal and professional relationships with Panamanian citizens, government officials, engineers, workers, so on and so forth. These are very valuable kinds of insights about everyday life. These interviews give us kind of a different take on events like World War II. Imagine what it was like to be in the Panama Canal Zone when you first learned about Pearl Harbor and what had happened versus what it would have been like to be in New York or in Florida. It's a fascinating divergence, if you will. The 60s look very different from the Panama Canal Zone because people are talking about international events. People talk about what happened in France. People talk about the civil rights movement. People talk about international revolutionary currents, but again, they're talking about them from the Panama Canal Zone. Technology, ship piloting techniques change over time. We have some, what I find to be very fascinating interviews with pilots who guided ships through those logs, who took the ships in. One of them, Albert Wilder, a highly decorated World War II combat veteran who was in one of the most remarkable, survivor, one of the most remarkable North Atlantic convoy situations ever. A lot of information in the interviews, and a really, I think Paul Morgan mentioned this earlier, but the profound impact, the reciprocal impact of Panamanian and Latin American values and politics on an overseas U.S. community. Because what we've learned in the oral history narratives is that this was not a self-contained community. There were many interactions with people inside and outside the zone between those different groups. And when I think about the narratives, I listened to a few of these before the session today. There's a profound humility and generosity that comes through in these narratives. It comes shining through. And if you're familiar with the literatures of Latin America, you'll recognize these traits of generosity, of welcoming, of humility. These are not narratives, and I have some students here, so it'd be interesting to see how they react, because I'm teaching a course on colonialism and anti-colonialism right now. But these are not narratives of Yankee imperialism. There are many candid moments when narrators criticize themselves and others for sometimes treating Panamanian citizens and or African descent workers as lesser than, right? And so there are these candid memories of inequality, of oppression at times, which are very poignant, very powerful. And I would say they're thoughtful memories of a very complex time and a complex place. And what I'm going to do in a few minutes is actually read a few of these narratives for you so you kind of get a flavor of what I'm trying to communicate. So I'd like to suggest we're already building an archive of oral histories that researchers can already begin really mining for useful information on a variety of topics. I'll just mention a few here in addition to those I've already talked about. Social organization and community life for U.S. citizens overseas. This is a 60-year chronicle of how life changes in one community over time. Ideas on U.S. foreign policy, not again from Florida or from Seattle, but in an overseas community. Invaluable glimpses into race and labor, and Paul mentioned earlier, labor unionism. Unions were very, very important in the history of the development of the Panama Canal. A lot of great narratives about those. The organization of the Ship Pilots Union, for example. Both Mr. Wilder and other pilots were very involved in that labor union. Memories of everyday social relations and changes over time in a whole variety of things. Whether you're talking about gender relations, in other words, relations between men and women, ideas about marriage, ideas about womanhood, a whole raft of issues. But I want to read a few of the narratives to you. I'm not going to call out any names of the individuals, but you will be able to read these online. And they kind of fall into some of these categories I've already mentioned. So I want to read a few about social organization and community life. And the first is from a husband and wife couple that we interviewed a couple of years ago. And it goes like this. In the Canal Zone, we were living in a quite benign system of socialism. Everybody was salaried who lived there. There were Americans who were in business in Panama City, but the Canal Zone was kind of a socialistic system. Salaries were squashed together, so craftsmen made more relative to the United States, and people at upper levels made less relative to the United States. Considering current debates over wages in the U.S., this is very interesting. There were no fancy big houses. There were no slums. So the quality of houses also was, I'll call it, squashed together toward the median rather than extremes in either direction. That's a fascinating observation about social organization. So the second narrative from an individual, I think it was a paradise, talking about the Panama Canal Zone, was an excellent place to raise children. It was purely socialistic with a totalitarian governor, but a good one. The system owned all property, all the fire stations, all the hospitals, all the schools, everything belonged to the government. Therefore, they had complete control of everything. And then the question is, now you would say it was a great place to raise children. Why is that? The response is, if you didn't work there or are dependent of a person who did work there, you couldn't stay there. Therefore, you didn't have a lot of unemployed people. You didn't have poor people. And when they get up to 62, they had to retire. Mandatory retirement at 62. So you didn't have, this is going to sound ageist, but this is what it says, you didn't have old and decrepit people. There it is. Sometimes in oral history you get a lot of candor. That's very good. So since the government ran everything, they made sure that you were healthy, wealthy, and treated well. You didn't have to do anything. They took care of you. And again, caring is a really powerful theme. Almost every single interview, the concept, again, of caring, of generosity, of community really comes through. Now, a lot of the interviews talk about ideas of U.S. Foreign policy overseas. As you can imagine, those of you who've been interviewed, a lot of folks had interesting ideas about President Jimmy Carter. I'll reserve those for now. Although, well, no, I won't. I'm going to give you a narrative. This was from an individual, a male narrator. He said, I always felt that this idea that the Panamanians couldn't run the canal was just a complete fantasy that people had made up to make themselves feel good about themselves, you know? And sure, the people who were working in the canal at that time couldn't have done it. They had to be developed. In other words, they had to learn, right? Someone had to teach them. So the plan that was put together by Carter and the Canal Administration, and in fact my boss, so now you probably know what I'm talking about, was a very far-sighted plan because it developed these people into pilots and tugboat operators and power plant operators and machinists and gave them more apprenticeships and so on. So by the time it was time to do the handover, it was seamless. I mean, it was just like you get up the next day and do the same stuff, because by then the Panamanians had been totally integrated. And it was appropriate that they should be. It was crazy that the idea that they shouldn't be is just, you know, people who live in a constrained environment get this bunker mentality about life. Now, I mentioned to you narratives about race and labor, and I find these to be particularly, and I have a colleague, Dr. Green, who I know will be very, very, very interested in these narratives. So this is from a couple's interview. I remember when we first got here, we were driving. We were talking about coming to the Canal Zone in the late 50s, early 60s. We bought ourselves, well, this must be in the 60s, we bought ourselves a little black VW. About 3 days after we got here, we were driving around looking at what we were going to be living in for a while. We came around a corner, and there was a guy digging a sewer or a water pipe or something, and there were 5 black guys down in a hole, and there was a big, tall, fat white guy leaning against the palm tree reading a newspaper. There was a lot of that. Now, this is a white narrator who's saying this. Remember I said earlier, very frank memories and narratives about race and labor. Here's the second narrative. This is a narrative of a person who's trying to explain to us what the Canal Zone rests upon, the labor of people who work there. He said the following: they used different colored money in terms of the coupons for the commissary. The dollar was what everyone used in the Panama and the Canal Zone, but they rode not just in the back of the bus, they rode in different buses. They didn't ride in the back of the train, they rode in the back of the car. They had a different section of the train separated by the baggage car. The railroad station was divided by the baggage room. Segregation was complete, and it's what got the canal built. The Panama Canal was built, I would say, on the back of the black man. The white man was the cadre. He gave the orders. There might have been 5,000 to 7,000 whites, but the bulk of them were from Barbados. The black man, he's the one who carried the bananas. He's the one who dug the ditches. He's the one who had the DDT or whatever strapped to his back, spraying ditches for mosquitoes to clear malaria, that kind of thing. The labor was done by the black man. The supervision was done by the white man, who was paid in gold and blacks were paid in silver. There was a gold roll and a silver roll, so that made all the difference in the world, and very, very few Panamanians were hired, and some got on the gold roll, but most of everyone else was just on the silver roll, except for the Americans. Now, as an American historian of race, what I find very interesting and very important about this insight is, again, this is a white narrator. When I interview white folks about the Jim Crow system of segregation in the US, I rarely get this kind of candor. I rarely get people who frankly talk about racial and labor inequalities in the US in the 30s, 40s, or 50s. Most often, those types of folks will say, well, that's just how things were. That's just the way things were. And I didn't really pay too much attention to it. What you find in these interviews is a tremendous depth of perception and memory and an understanding of these kind of asymmetrical social relations. I think that these are really invaluable for that reason alone. I mentioned change over time, and I'm just going to conclude with a couple of narratives. This is from a female narrator, and she's talking about both segregation, but also how things change over time. What we've learned about the Canal Zone, it was never a static place. It was constantly in motion, constantly in change. It was only on the surface that it appeared everything was always the way it had been. When I was stationed at Fort Davis, the civilians, as I recall, lived up on a hill, and we just didn't know much about them. It looked as if they were living in their own kind of world, and it looked as if it was a static, unchanging world. But when you study these interviews, you realize that times were changing quickly in the Canal Zone. And so this female narrator says the following: well, we had changes there, but we entered into life down there in two separate systems. And you'll hear about that from everybody, I'm sure. There was a gold roll, which was the US, and a silver roll, which was the locals, which were mostly Jamaican, mostly the local Jamaicans that came there to build the canal and their descendants. Everything was separate pay standards, separate bathrooms, separate trains. If you were on the train, it was trains in the back for the silver people, the local. When I talk about it now, I don't know, it makes me uncomfortable to think of how we lived and how we accepted it. We had separate commissaries, separate movie theaters, separate everything, separate town sites, and those had separate schools. They were never integrated. The whole time we were there, they never were. There was less distinction, though, in the workplace eventually. Things changed over time. The lines of the post office were separate, and eventually that was eliminated. And I appreciated the civil rights movement, but when I went to be the equal employment investigator, we adopted all those principles of the new legislation that was implemented to prevent discrimination. And here we see the connections between what's happening in the US, what's happening in the Canal Zone. You could also add a broader sense, particularly the people that we interviewed kind of a little later on. Over time, you start asking better questions when you do oral history interviews. And the last 5 or 10 that we've done, we've asked more of these kind of comparative, broader questions. What kind of impact did the civil rights movement have on people in the zone? What kind of impact did the larger uprisings in Latin America have on the consciousness of people in the zone? And again, we're getting very interesting responses about that. So I think I'll kind of wrap it up here. I will say that we also asked about, questions about the 1964 riots, questions about the invasion, the U.S. invasion, and again, very diverse answers, very thoughtful answers. It's been a real privilege for me individually, again, to be able to return to Panama, to think about this very important relationship that we have, to think about history and how many of the narrators in this collection, I think, are trying to tell us that there were many good things about living in the Panama Canal Zone, but there were bad things too. And let's not repeat the bad things. Let's remember the good. Let's remember the generosity. Let's remember the fact that people enjoyed their work. Imagine that. They liked what they did. Many of them who worked with their hands or their heads also worked with their hearts as well. Finally, we're just getting started. 51 oral histories is not a large collection. We need to do a lot more. We look forward to doing a lot more with our colleagues in the libraries and Latin American studies and Zonians. So thank you very much.
Any questions for our panelists?
Thank you all very much. That was great. I want to ask Paul about how do you store the oral histories? Are they available online or archived at the library? And also, how are you funded? Is this you get funded from the university or from the library?
The question is where are the interviews stored? And they're stored, I guess, up there in that little screen. It's in the UFBC. It's Paul can tell you exactly where they are, but eventually you'll be able to click on all of the oral histories. We just finished transcribing the last interview, so now we have all 51 transcribed, and eventually they will be there to kind of click and to go through. In terms of funding, the museum has been very generous. We've been very lucky to be part of the consortium. We are going to be looking kind of going forward, though, for more sources of funding. Oral history is very time-consuming. It's very expensive. Transcribing takes a lot of time and energy. Digital transfer takes a lot of time and energy, as my colleague Paul can tell you. So that is just kind of a snapshot.
For those who are interested, I think I showed a link up there. UFDC, which stands for University of Florida Digital Collections, .ufl.edu/PCM will get you to the oral histories and to some of the pictures that you saw.
I have a question. I have been asking different people for several years about the silver roll and the gold roll. That's something we learned in Panama. I have a question I've been asking for several years, different people, but so far I cannot get an answer for this. About the silver roll and the gold roll, that's something we learned in Panama since high school. What happened with the Black Americans working in the canal zone? They were in the silver roll or the gold roll?
The answer to that, and Mike O'Connor might want to chime in too. The U.S. is real confused about what to do with African Americans. Thank you, you're so good at that. And ultimately created what they call the elevated silver roll for African Americans because they weren't comfortable putting them on either the gold or the silver roll.
Comment on Paul Ortiz, what you read from the excerpts from the recordings was closer to the canal zone as I lived it and felt it than anything I've ever heard, except maybe Clysonsburg in 1947. It was beautiful here back. It was quite moving, to be honest.
We couldn't hear that.
Let Paul characterize it.
Well, we were talking about the power of the narratives and how there's a beauty to these narratives, and they really take you back to that time. Memory is tricky, right? We all remember things selectively, but at the same time, that's why we're trying to build a larger body of these interviews, because then we can to compare these memories. But I was moved mean, these are moving, very powerful narratives.
I have a question for Paul. Are you also?
Which one?
Which one?
Ortiz, sorry. Ortiz. Because for every Panamanian who lived before the council ended, it's part of everybody's memories in some way or another. So are you interviewing also Panamanians and the members of the council? Because I remember as a child in my school in Panama, not in the canal zone, whoever had access to candies for the canal zone was higher up in the pecking order. It's just one detail, but it's also part of the memories of everybody, and I wonder if you're also
Currently, no, but we would like to. That's what, that's why I was saying we're really in the beginning stages. There are repositories that have, as you know, in Panama, that have interviews for people. But I think we need to, in some cases, maybe not duplicate the work that's already been done, but bring it together, bring it into dialogue. Because I mentioned earlier also the lack of African descent interviews as well. So we're just really getting started, but it's an excellent point to make. We've got to do those types of interviews.
I'll just add that
I think one of the great things about being able to put things online, it means that they are accessible to research. This is a story with, as I guess Professor Donahue was saying, many sides to it. But by putting things online, it's accessible so that people who can draw from many different sources. And so I think the work that we're doing to put things online, I know I've heard that people in Panama who are doing research from the Panamanian perspective, but what matters is to have access to the information, your interpretation, etc. That's what you do with it. That's something else. But we're putting it online, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that I see a lot of opportunities by making things available in digital format for, like what you're saying, is that to bring things together so that people who are doing research in Panama can draw from sources that we have, etc.
Other questions today? We thank you very much for attending.